Well, thanks so much for coming. Just before we air the first of the two pieces, I just wanted to just give you some rough background on the trip. It just took us several months really to set up and work on it because it's quite complicated getting the visa process done now and all of the permits that you need to work inside Sudan. There's no point going to work in TV if you don't have an enormous amount of paperwork and official looking papers. So we set off on the 10th of April and we were there for 15 days. After that, we took a few days to do our edits, but it was thanks to the generosity of the Pulitzer Center that we were able to spend so much time there. What was really important to our reporting was to be able to really get out of Juba and to get into areas that were worst affected, to really have that on-the-ground approach to our reporting and to get lots of different elements. So when I went to South Sudan to cover the famine, I felt like I'm going to cover a famine, and I understand the nuances behind it. I understand that decades of poverty and conflict can compound food insecurity, and that's likely what we've seen there, similar to what we've seen in Somalia, where food insecurity, climate change, drought, these things are compounded by war. Conflict makes it more difficult to get food into places. It just makes it much more difficult for people to have any kind of security in their lives. But I was quite shocked when I got on the ground and realized that the parameters of this famine are much, much more simple. Instead of seeing vast swathes of starving people, we were hearing these stories about families who had basically lost up to half of their members on the road, fleeing the conflict. And I was shocked at the direct link between the conflict. The conflict wasn't making hunger worse in South Sudan. It was actually causing people to starve to death. And this was quite shocking for me. I basically called my foreign editor from my hotel room in Juba after my first few days there and said, I really think that our lead story is not a story about famine. Our lead story is a story about war. And the famine is essentially a symptom of the war and not vice versa. And so this was certainly something that we took to heart whenever we were on the ground there, having spoken to so many people. A lot of people there who we would speak to, and we would go out to areas where we would find people who were coming out of the bush to try to get help. And they would look a little puzzled when I would ask them about hunger all the time, but they would when I would say, why are you hungry? Why have you fled? Why do you not have any food? Obvious question that we have to ask to get the information across on television. People always looked rather puzzled, and every story was exactly the same. It was soldiers or troops have come in and killed a lot of people in our village, and we fled. We ran into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes we're wearing and our children. And so you heard the horrific story of the first man we interviewed there, and when he talked about how he had been forced into cannibalism of his child, which was really quite unbelievable. But he didn't talk about that first whenever we approached him. The first thing he said to me whenever I walked up to him with a translator before the cameraman got set up was, please, can I have a fishing rod? And he was just desperate to keep the rest of his family alive, because here he is with no means to get food. I mean, he'll come out whenever there are food drops from the ICRC or the WFP, but so these are the kind of stories that people were saying, and it was an incredibly simple story, and nothing about South Sudan is simple, but in terms of why people are hungry, that was directly the result. And I think that it's important to get across that that's why when you turn on the television, South Sudan's not getting anywhere near as much coverage as it should, but even when it is covered, you'll not see skeletal people like Ethiopia 84, and we were in many, many places where people were hungry. But the truth is that people are dying far, far away from the world's video cameras and the press reports, because they're in vast, vast remote areas. And that's where most people are dying. And the best that we can try to do as reporters is to talk to the survivors, to the people who've managed to make it out. And just one other point I'd like to talk about with regards to that story is that it's very much so a nuance of this famine that the government of South Sudan doesn't want us to talk about. It's very difficult to access what we need to get around South Sudan at all. The aid agencies are what we really rely on to get anywhere, to get flights out, to get to the worst affected areas. And the aid agencies are in a very, very difficult position. They want journalists to cover this famine, but they cannot be seen to be facilitating what is seen by the government as negative reports. And so this is a big, big difficulty for them. More than one aid agency requested that we not mention their name if our report was going to cover the war instead of the famine. So this need to dichotomize between the two, I think, is affecting the message that's coming out of South Sudan. And part of that is that, you know, the government really don't want journalists in there covering why people are so hungry and why they're dying. We were detained repeatedly on the streets of Juba and arrested just for filming, even though we had all permits and press passes and every bit of paper that you would need necessary. And shortly after we left, you know, journalists were detained. The Al Jazeera English bureau was shut. So it's certainly rapidly declining in terms of trying to get out this message as to what exactly is causing the hunger there. Thanks again for sitting through that if you've already seen it. We'll go to Q&A in just a moment, but I just wanted to reiterate, you know, we talked in that piece about the logistical challenges of getting around in South Sudan. Of course, for us as journalists, we rely on the aid agencies. For the aid agencies right now, since we left, the rains essentially started in our last 2 days in South Sudan, which was late April. The rains now make it much, much more difficult for them to get food, even to the areas that they can access. You saw planes dropping food there, and us flying on airplanes. Now they'll have to rely on helicopters because even the small dirt runways don't really operate in the rain. So they have to rely on helicopters. You heard from Deep Mala from Mercy Corps there. She spoke at length to me about how much more expensive and how much more logistically difficult it gets in the rainy season. So any hunger that's going on now, it'll be harder for them to get food to people up until September because the rains will be quite intense, and an awful lot of a country slightly larger than France is inaccessible to them. So the images that you see there of planes landing and taking off will become more and more rare in the coming months. So if you'd like to ask any questions, go on ahead and get started. Put this down.
Going to pass around the microphones. Questions? I have a number myself. I'll start with Dick.
Thank you very much for that. I guess this is on, yes. Thank you very much. This is the second time for me, and I appreciated it even more this time than before in terms of the poignant message that you've delivered to us, so thank you for that. My question is, the people in their desperation, do they ever talk about peace? Do they see peace as a possibility, or do they feel totally abandoned? What can you say about their mood other than one of desperation?
Well, I think whenever you talk to people from rural areas about peace, to them, I'm not sure that everybody really thinks of peace on a national level. To someone, you know, in rural South Sudan, peace to them means going back to their house and their small vegetable patch and whatever small amount of livestock they had. I think peace and security and economic security are completely bound together for them. And so I think people do hope for peace, but their fear is their inability to go home. For as long as they can't go home, then they will be dependent on aid agencies forever. So people do want peace, but they only see it whenever they can return home. And people in the refugee camps that we spoke to, or the POCs, those protection of civilian sites, a lot of them are not very hopeful about being able to return home soon. So for them, that peace of mind of being able to go home still eludes them.
Two quick questions. Just to follow up on two things in the reports. One on access, that you talked about the restrictions of the Salva Kiir government. And I'm curious about access to the other side, to Riek Machar, the Nuer side of the civil war. Is there access at all? Were you able to do that? And the second question, you talk about the UN peacekeeping force, the 13,000 soldiers who are there, but they're not doing, and the implicit in there is that they could do more. And what would and should they be doing that they're not doing now, and would it make a difference?
Thank you. Well, on the first question, it is incredibly difficult to access rebel-held areas. The only way they're from inside the country would be to elude the government forces to get out there. It's not unheard of. There was an Al Jazeera English journalist who managed to get into a rebel-held area by smuggling across, I believe it was the Ugandan border. But that's the only case I've heard of. Otherwise, the rebels are very much so on I mean in terms of going in and talking to rebels. We were in rebel-held areas there, but you can only go in with the aid agencies. So where we saw Rebecca and Marco, that's rebel-held or controlled area. So that's you were able to do that, but we can't go into rebel military facilities, the sort of places that are more and more difficult to get into. But the rebels will tolerate our presence if we are hosted by an aid agency, and we don't basically. I mean, we managed to sneak a few pictures of those rebels in there, but it's almost impossible to get military in bed with them. If that's what you mean.
And UN peacekeeping for where they are and
Yeah.
how they're deployed.
The UN peacekeeping force do have a mandate to use force, and they have failed several times. In quite high-profile incidences like last July's violence in Juba. The force commander was dismissed, and there was an inquiry by Ban Ki-moon that was an independent inquiry that the UN commissioned that saw gross failings, including refusal to act whenever government soldiers were attacking people inside the protection of civilian sites. That's the main challenge, is that again and again when tested, they haven't stopped attacks. And so what can help, and no one's expecting, I think, the UN reasonably to be able to leave their compounds and enforce peace whenever fighting breaks out. But what is essential is that they protect the people that are within the camps, because the camps are the very last line of protection. Initially, people ran to the churches, and then people ran to the UN compounds, and if there's nowhere else for them to run. So if attacks continue to happen on these refugee camps, then that's going to be something that the UN will be increasingly criticized for, because that is the one small area they're meant to be protecting.
Thank you so much for an interesting and thoughtful presentation. What are the relations now between the North Sudan and the South Sudan? And do the people in South Sudan regret gaining so-called independence, which led to a civil war and suffering? Is there any effort to reunite the country and as one way of stopping this turmoil and crisis?
Well, I think the difficulty in relationships between the North and the South contributed to the breakout of this conflict in terms of the breakdown of agreements over how to basically share the oil, and how the extraction of money from the oil was going to be basically made. And oil is by far, I think it's 98% of the income of the South Sudanese government. So when those relations broke down, that directly contributed to the outbreak of violence, because when the money stops flowing, people start falling out. But I don't think there's any talk of reunification. I think South Sudanese people feel as though their leadership in South Sudan has failed them, but I don't feel like, certainly nobody that we spoke to were seriously talking about any regrets that the country had been formed, just regret that an opportunity had been lost to, in its first few years, to really get its economy off the ground and forge a peaceful nation.
Yes, I had a question. Your reporting is rather recent, so I guess my question is, do you see, I've heard some people talk, South Sudanese, particularly in the diaspora, say that their sense is there may be some war weariness coming, that the military has not been paid. We've seen this Paul Malong firing, we've seen new factions emerge and splits. Obviously, there are huge constraints resource-wise. I'm just wondering if you picked up any kind of end game, even if it's not a willful end game, but just kind of a running out of gas sort of situation.
Sure, those developments have been really important. I'm not sure that people on the ground seem to be interpreting them as an end to the war, more as the next stage. The war seems to be fragmenting enormously. Certainly the payment of soldiers is a big issue. In Juba, there would be regular rumors that the soldiers were looting and everybody would not leave the hotel or would not leave their homes because the economic crisis is causing a panic amongst them. And I think that the economic crisis could also, because of the lack of salaries for soldiers, be contributing to some of the violence that we see and looting and such like. I didn't see any evidence that people feel like this is an indicator that the war could end. Of course, the Civil War of the past, was one that got equally complicated, where it fragmented along similar lines. So I think there's a fear, in fact, that things could get worse if there is a newer pushback, if the rebels push back. The problem is, once, it's not necessarily soldier on soldier anymore. Now there's a lot of bad feeling and bad blood between the civilians who want their villages back. And I think that's actually quite dangerous. And I think that's what the UN are really talking about when they worry about a genocide. And so I don't think we're going to see an end to the conflict because of those developments that we've seen.
Kind of related to that last question and the UN in particular, what did you see on the ground, and maybe in people you spoke to at the UN, about their approach to the future? Are the UN leadership in country talking about an end to the war or moving towards, development or early recovery? And as well with the peacekeepers, are they still kind of on their back foot? Or are they able to start doing more strident and robust peacekeeping and long-range patrols? I worked there for about 5 years, and I was really shocked by the UN leadership approach to how they manage the POCs. Given that's like the last hope for people, they're living in absolute squalor and hell. And yet UN leadership that didn't want to see those POCs developed to allow just basic service provision. And that was in 2013, 2014. And I've heard that it's still similar, but I'd be interested in what you saw most recently about their approach to the next steps.
Well, you do hear, what you're talking about there, the criticism of how the POCs are run. You do hear that off the record in conversations with aid workers who say that they feel like they're being very badly run, that the UN don't want this to become a permanent policy. They don't want to be, responsible for guarding 200,000 people in these camps. What I would say about what the UN were saying was very little. It was very difficult to get the UN to give an extensive, lengthy interview. Our interview was actually about 12 minutes long. Before, I think they are very nervous about criticism since the report came out, and I would advise people to read the report because it gives a good idea of what's going on and the failings that have happened.
Which report?
It was the one that was commissioned by the UN itself. It came out, I think, in December or January. So I went on patrol with the UN for this piece, and we really just wanted to get some picture. And I was assured in that interview that the peacekeepers were now patrolling on foot regularly every single day. But when we went out on patrol with the peacekeepers, their commander assured me they had never patrolled on foot and never will. So we ended up driving around Juba, and we would drive in our vehicle, and we were not able to film in Juba without being arrested. So it was quite exciting to be able to go with like 50 UN soldiers, and then all of the plainclothes police couldn't arrest us. But they were still quite aggressive and angry that we were filming. But the UN drove around the town, but they never ever get off their vehicles, and there doesn't seem to be any indicator that that's going to change.
Thanks so much for this. I did see them. This is my second time seeing both section segments as well, but it didn't lose its impact the second time. Quite some time ago now, the Nuer and the Dinka made peace, and that's in part what allowed independence to become a reality. That's not explained by the war now is not explained solely, I don't think, by the oil controversy. There's a lot more to it. The part of the story that I'm at all familiar with, and I'm not an expert by any means, is the return of the refugees from Sudan, from Ethiopia, from all the places where Sudanese refugees were. And that's where I first knew them, because I worked for UNHCR. When they came back, full of hope, full of enthusiasm, to their villages, which they hadn't seen some of them ever, there were problems almost right away, because there were land disputes, cattle thievery, the kinds of things that you would expect in this circumstances. So I'm wondering your opinion. You don't have the documentation on it. Is part of the war, the present conflict, due to land and due to the wish of whatever side is winning to take the land from the others and to control it? Was a return migration part of the problem?
I think that certainly contributed to it, and the answer to your question about land and this, the answer is absolutely yes. I think there's certainly a feel that after independence, that the problem with leadership and governance in South Sudan was that the country was perhaps treated as the spoils of war. And you saw from Malakal there that's right up in the north. Malakal is uncomfortably close to oil-producing areas of South Sudan, and I think that it's certainly most people believe that the reasons that there is ethnic fighting over the city is because Dinka feel uncomfortable with the Nuer and Shilluk, of course it's a mostly Shilluk town, being so close to oil areas, and that's certainly been an issue with ethnic cleansing, and vice versa. The Nuers trying to have committed atrocities in that town as well, and Nuer rebels. So it certainly is about the spoils of war, and I think that what has also contributed, however, beyond just those who had returned, is that in many cases the oil money that was flowing was being used to keep everybody happy. I mean, the SPLA is a very large, very bureaucratic, massive organization, and it took a lot of money to keep all of the generals basically on board and somewhat unified. I think when that money dried up, then there was more of a panic over land and who was going to get to basically stake their claim on it.
You mentioned at the beginning that when you first got there and you were trying to tell a story about famine, you realized you couldn't tell that story until you told the story of conflict and war. And I'm wondering if there were any other instances where you sort of set out to tell something and then realized that there was another more pressing matter that you needed to address. Especially, I mean, you talked to so many people, so many civilians who each had such, harrowing, traumatic stories to share. Was there ever a moment where you felt, okay, this might need a little bit more focus, or I need to delve deeper into this where you might not have anticipated that?
Absolutely. I think that happened with all three of our stories, and I think it's a good sign when you're reporting on the ground and you haven't gone in with an idea of what you've gone in with an idea of what's going on, but then it's been completely shaped. I think that's much better than forcing your own story. But yeah, we find that again and again. For instance, in the intensive care ward at that International Medical Corps hospital, I was expecting to see many dying babies, and we didn't see them. And the reason is because dying babies don't make it to Juba. And so, of course, there's lots of needy children, a lot of hungry children, malnourished children in these refugee camps. They don't get a very good diet there. But, that contributes to the story. Then we go out to try to find them, and we can't find them. We just hear witness accounts of them dying. A similar situation was when we wanted to do a story on the use of rape as a weapon of war. I was shocked to go and talk to women who were rape victims. That was the third story. We didn't air it here, but tonight. But I went to speak to women who had been raped, and I thought they would have told me about having been attacked in their villages, and that's why they fled. But instead, actually, they had fled to the capital city, and anytime they left the refugee camps, they had been raped in the street in the capital in broad daylight by government soldiers. So, that's a story in itself, and that teaches us more about how they can never leave those refugee camps. Going home is a dream, but if they can't even go to the market to buy some food, then. So again and again that did happen because South Sudan is a fast developing story. We don't know much about it when we fly in, so it's one of those stories where you have to be enormously perceptive and open-minded when you land.
Yeah.
In the front and in the back. I forgot.
I'm Richard Jones. A number of us here are friends of the churches in Sudan. And you mentioned the churches being a first place to run to and the fails and the camps. Did you have occasion to meet church leaders? Did you have impressions of indigenous church leaders, of their contribution to helping people survive?
We didn't really get a chance to speak to church leaders who were inside the worst affected areas because at this stage those people have all fled. These places are ghost towns.
Malakal, for sure.
Yeah, Malakal and Lear and any of the areas that we were in, the churches had very much so been, you know, abandoned, and the church folk had left. In Malakal refugee camp, I was lucky enough to be there on Easter Sunday. There were religious ceremonies that day. I wasn't able to attend church, but I went to a women's event afterwards for some of the women who'd been in congregation at the church. So they were still very much so practicing their church in the refugee camp. But I think the difficulty there is that, I mean, that's not really, that's a powerless place to be inside the refugee camp. So there wasn't, in my experience, I didn't see an ability for churches to give anybody shelter or to help people, simply because the areas we'd been to had been so devastated.
Yeah. Hey, in your recent travels, what did you hear, if anything, on where all these soldiers are getting their small arms, ammunition, gasoline, spare parts, etc., especially ammunition?
Well, we weren't
And
really,
who's paying for it?
I'd like to know. We weren't really able to. I mean, nobody from the government would speak to us, so we weren't even able to really challenge them on those subjects. There has been other reporters have done some investigative work into that. You know, obviously, neighboring countries have not been able to, or certainly have not been willing to implement sanctions on the government. So it's not clear. Obviously, there's rumors of, you know, arms coming from Uganda, arms coming from various places, but there's no evidence of that at this point. That wasn't necessarily a story that I was looking into on this trip.
Again, thank you for your courage and stamina in putting this together. Do you get the feeling that there is a strong United States diplomatic presence on top of the situation, or are things kind of drifting?
Well, I wasn't really spending much time at the American embassy there, but I get the impression that in Juba the situation is so insecure that it's very difficult for there to be a strong American diplomatic presence on the ground, you know, in any real capacity in and around the town. In the attacks last July, whenever government soldiers entered a hotel compound, one thing that was noted from that was that Americans were singled out for attack by the soldiers. So I think it's fair to say that the animosity towards foreigners right now is extreme, and I think for Americans on the ground, it's increasingly dangerous. I met one American aid worker in an extremely remote area working with food distribution, but other than that, it's extremely difficult for Americans. So I'm not an expert in what the diplomatic presence was there at the American embassy, but I would imagine, given the security constraints, that it would be very difficult for them to be widespread around the city, but I'm not an expert on the numbers.
Hi. You mentioned the contradiction between what the top brass at the UN was telling you about the nature of their military involvement there, and what the middle managers on the ground there were telling you about how they did their work. I was wondering whether you included that in your story series, and if you did not, why not?
Well, that one detail about patrolling by foot, I mean, that's simply the, I didn't include that in my story, that's simply the kind of, not everything makes the cut, basically. But I've actually been working on an extended piece for Vox, which will be coming out very soon, about the crisis across Africa and Yemen, the crisis in hunger. And I went into detail there. You know, so often in print journalism, we're just able to put more nuance in about these stories. So in that piece, which hopefully will be published, will be online within the next few days, there's more on what you're talking about there, on the divergence between what there is officially being said and the reality on the ground for the kind of protection that is actually being provided for people.
Was your life ever in danger during this fascinating reporting?
I don't think so. I think that it's dangerous in South Sudan generally. There's always a degree of insecurity, but the danger is that the violence that can break out is quite random. But by flying rather than driving, that minimizes the danger, because most of the danger is ambushes, crime, and corrupt soldiers at checkpoints. So I don't. I think it's a risky area, but I didn't feel like my life was in danger. I think I was in danger being arrested. That was it.
I want to add my thanks to everyone else's, to you and the Pulitzer Center for doing this incredible reporting. But having been a reporter in Sudan 20 and even 30 years ago, I find myself hearing a lot of the same things that we were reporting on in those days. And I can even remember going to Sudan just like you on a story about famine and finding out that the story was really all about the first civil war. And I just wonder, did you see any historical sensibility? Do people realize that it's all being repeated again with the people you met?
Yeah, I mean, the people that we met, you know, I think they were very much so aware of the fact that this is just an ongoing conflict. I certainly didn't get the impression that people were sort of seeing that as the past war and this as a completely new war. I think, unfortunately, war is normal and peace is a respite from war. So I think, unfortunately, the only other place that I've seen that so endemic is in Afghanistan, where you'll have 2 generations of people who have lived through war. So yeah, I mean, people weren't openly commenting on how, you know, we've had war all of our lives, but it was obvious when you talk to people that has shaped their psyche.
Somewhat of a related question, and that is, given the proliferation of conflict that's going on in South Sudan and the culture of revenge that seemingly is taking over the country, in your conversations with people, were you able to sense the depth of their anger, their hatred for those who had caused the conflict and their suffering? How did that get expressed? Did it get expressed? And I ask that because I'm also part of the church community, and peace and reconciliation is something that we're concerned about. And it seems to me that as the conflict continues and as the wounds deepen, the task of reconciliation becomes all the more daunting, if not nigh unto impossible.
Unfortunately, I do think that is going to become an increasing problem. People have long memories in war, and you know, one of the saddest things that I saw, I mean, I never heard anybody openly declare that their desire for revenge. I've spoken to aid workers who have heard it a lot and are very nervous about it. But one thing that made me quite sad was in Malakal refugee camp, and that's about maybe 3 miles outside of the town. You drive into it, and when you drive down into it, the aid agencies the workers will very quickly explain to you that on the right are the Shilluk, and on the left are the Nuer. And these people who are fleeing the same violence, the same enemy to them, are divided. I think that's a very dangerous concern. The fact that camps are having to divide people along ethnic lines is something that is probably a very dangerous sign for peace and reconciliation.
I had a question also on the matter of context and sort of historical context and how these issues are presented. And striking, thinking about the UN forces, for example, and that's $1 billion a year or something, a huge amount of money that goes in to support soldiers who, for the most part, are only protecting themselves in isolated areas, and they're not able to impose or create peace. But they're salaried positions, there are lots of officials associated with that. So if you're an average person in South Sudan, you know, trying to survive on the margins of those camps, and you're seeing the SUVs go by, and you're seeing the expats that are associated with aid workers, you see a lot of money being spent, but not much for there. And then you look at the larger picture, and you know, I also had the opportunity to report in Sudan in the early 2000s in the lead up to South Sudan's independence, and you know, very striking to me to see that image of Colin Powell and Susan Rice, Obama's national security advisor, together at the independence ceremony, and in my mind, that has always been kind of the obverse, the reverse image of the lead up to the Iraq War. This was a consensus decision, a bipartisan consensus in the United States international community that this was the solution for Sudan. And in my own experience in being in Sudan, I felt in traveling through southern Sudan before independence, in knowing that there were only a few hundred miles of paved roads, no infrastructure, no educational system, and very little prospect for a successful, independent southern Sudan. I wish that we had spent a lot more time thinking about how to reconcile at that point, how to keep an integrated Sudan that would have met the needs of all the marginalized people, whether they were in Darfur or southern Sudan or Bejar or wherever. We didn't do that, and I look back, and another thing, we do a lot at the Pulitzer Center with schools and colleges and educational outreach, and so we're always taking our journalism out and trying to use it as the basis for conversations in classrooms and make students, young people, everybody realize that there are global connections to everything that we do. There are local repercussions of things that happen far away. There are repercussions far away of what we do. There's a tendency in reports like this, the danger is that you see it, and you see this awful suffering, violence, famine, and you think, thank God I'm not there, and what could have possessed those people to have that happen? But I look at it and I think, well, the international community was part of creating that situation. We pushed very hard to create this government that depended on the likes of Salva Kiir and Ruach Mashir, and we squandered billions of dollars. We let them squander billions of dollars in aid that went into that country from 2011 to 2015, and you would be hard-pressed to find any result, any positive consequence in the way of schools or roads or health clinics across southern Sudan that got built in that time period. So that, to me, the context is really important.
Yeah, I think that South Sudan in many ways will be looked back on as you've pointed out, as a country that's been heavily dependent on billions, if not more, of dollars of aid, and with very little to show for it. And in some cases, we've seen it in Afghanistan, aid is a very complicated subject. In some cases, it can reinforce the corruption. And like you said, the government never really built schools and paid teachers or built roads. And the dependency on aid is such that it can hinder the development of a nation. But in terms of the issues that you're talking about with the creation of South Sudan, and did we get it wrong? Was there something that could have been done better in terms of the institutions? I mean, it's a PhD thesis, but certainly there were mistakes made. I think that perhaps there was an underestimation of the amount of bad blood left over from the previous war. I mean, a lot of people who spoke to me who come from opposition areas in the south, not nowhere. People coming from places like Pajak, where there had been terrible violence whilst I was there, were saying, the Dinka troops resent us because they think that we were, allied with the North. And so there are all of these resentments that have made it impossible for leadership to get to basically start building those institutions. I'm not. It's very, very complicated. It's not clear whether or not how that could have been avoided, because these were the leaders of the two main tribes. Perhaps an overestimation of how much simply a declaration of peace between the Dinka and the Noor was that enough for the formation of a nation.
I have a question.
The microphone's coming.
Were you able to form an impression of how many peacekeeping troops were present in these POC camps?
Well, the numbers are online, that it's 13,000 uniforms.
Overall?
Overall across the country.
I'm talking about individual camps.
For individual camps, I mean, I think you're looking at over 1,000, maybe over a couple of thousand at any one time in the main camp in Juba. In Malakal camp, I'm not sure of the numbers there.
I would just suggest that it's very possible that the number of rebel or government troops that would threaten those camps would be enough to overwhelm a peacekeeping detachment. Now, maybe they should have died for the cause, but I suspect that was the choice.
It's definitely a conundrum. Now, I don't know the numbers of the soldiers that came in, but whenever both of the camps were attacked, but certainly it's fair to say that there are more government soldiers in South Sudan than there are UN peacekeepers. I think the controversy is whether or not there is a reasonable attempt, whether a shot has been fired to attempt to hold back any people trying to come into the camps. But certainly, if the peacekeepers were to directly get involved in a firefight with government troops, it certainly would not be a good situation. And whenever there was the fighting last July, there were 2 UN peacekeepers who were killed. I think they were Chinese, from the Chinese contingent. So they certainly would be in danger. That's a fair point.
I'm not trying to say that that shouldn't have happened.
Oh, I understand.
But it's just that things are often much more complicated than most of us think.
They are complicated. I think the difficulty for whenever you read through the reports as to, in the past what has gone wrong has been in terms of chain of command. The troops on the ground wait to be given orders, and if those orders don't come through, even if people are being killed and raped in front of them, I think that's where the breakdown has happened in the past.
One last question.
You've done a terrific job of presenting the situation. I wonder if the next round of reporting ought to be, and it's a different kind of reporting, on why efforts to solve the problem haven't succeeded throughout the international community.
Yes, I think that's definitely a really important story. For instance, why calls for sanctions, which would seem to be a very simple solution to at least reducing the violence. That's an important story. It's certainly a regional story in that part of Africa in terms of relations with the surrounding neighbors, and the UN's part in trying to bring more peace negotiations through. I think that would be really the most important follow-up.
Thank you.